In this lesson, we will learn how to move mesh using the Paint to Form tool and Soft Selection. Now, both of these tools are really helpful when you are working with landscape, especially when you want to have a kind of freehand approach to sculpting the geometry of the mesh itself. So what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to cut out the ocean that is coming up to our coast edge over here, and then we're going to look at how we can work with that mesh to make it more realistic when it comes to the texturing stage later on. So the first thing we can do to see what we're working with is to turn on the contour CAD layer. That's this one over here. And over here, the lowest contour line is where the ocean is meeting the land. So what you want to do at this point is you can do the same copy function where you press Ctrl V on your keyboard. You can copy that entire CAD layer, then isolate it, and we just want to extract the lower edge, the lower contour line. So again, just go and type in Ctrl I and then hit delete. Now, I'm not going to redo all of these steps for you, or at least on this video in front of you, since we have done exactly the same thing for the road. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video now, and I'm going to just continue to draw the contour line. So I'm just going to draw a straight line down and a straight line across, and then I'm going to use the Boolean and refine tool, just how I have done for the road earlier. Once this mesh is detached, then we will come back to the video and we will then have a look at how we can manipulate the mesh slightly differently to what we have been doing with the road. So now I've just finished the Boolean tool, and just in case you did miss the last lesson and you are curious about how that trimming tool looks like or how it works, just go back to the previous lesson where I showed you how that works with the driveway. So in any case, we have now completed the Boolean, and what you want to do now is you can convert it to an editable poly, and then you will have a look that once you select your poly selection, you will automatically have this selected. So I spoke about this in the last lesson where, because we had a solid object that had been joined, not open as it was in the case of the driveway, we now have all of this selected. So we don't have to manually go and do that. So it's really helpful to know why the poly selection is already pre-selected for you when you use the editable poly. It's extremely helpful, and it's an excellent tip just to always get that right. Otherwise, you will be manually selecting polys forever. So what we'd like to do now is we want to separate the two layers between the ocean and the land below. So we want to basically create two layers, one above each other. So what you can do is you can go and create a copy of this by, first of all, detaching it, and then type Ctrl V to make a copy, and one of those will be the ocean, and then the other will be the land below the ocean that we will see if we add some transparency to the water. So if this one is going to be the water, you can go and convert your selection to the vertex. So just type, or at least hold down Ctrl on your keyboard and click on vertex, and then just make all these Z points planar, so that's going to make it flat since it is the ocean, and we want to have it at minus 17 meters, which is the height of our sea level in our case. So the same thing here, you want to now take all these edges that are on the bottom edge and you want to make those also planar at that same height. So when you select vertex, you'll automatically have those selected because it still remembers that selection from when you did the Boolean tool. Now we want to go down and we want to make that planar, and same thing, type in minus 17 here so that they are all lining up with that C. So the same thing happens here. We want to basically start by making the top edge planar, or at least want to make it touch the land that is connecting to it. So we can actually now, if this is the ocean, we can make that a different color so we can see what we're working with. And let's go and extract these two that we are then going to be now working with. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just make the whole thing flat and planar, and then I'm going to start by manipulating it downwards to look like the sea bottom. So to do that, we repeat the same function. We're going to make the Z planar, and we're going to level everything off at minus 17. And now is the time when you can start using your mesh manipulation tools. So the two that we're going to be looking at are, first of all, the soft selection. So I'm just going to open that section up, and we're going to activate it by checking that box. And the main parameter that you want to increase and decrease is the fall off. You can have a look at the others in terms of pinch and bubble, but I generally just work with fall off. It pretty much does the job. So the main thing to know with the soft selection is that you will have a gradient that is automatically selected once you select one single vertex. So let's say I'm going to select this one in the corner. I'm going to now have this gradient that is going to be affected when I move it up and down. So instead of having the vertex moving independently, I'm now having the entire range that depends on that curvature set by these parameters. So that's an excellent tool that you can use when you are working with these type of meshes. And you can see that you can start to manipulate it up and down as the C-bottom. The one thing that you do have to be very careful of is that if you do start moving this around, let's say you move this downwards, you are going to disconnect this line of vertices that you have running along that edge. So just remember to be aware of that and make sure that you don't split your mesh apart as you do move things around. So what you can do is you can decrease your fall off so that none of the colored areas actually touch that side, and you can then start to manipulate that locally. The other tool that I wanted to show you in this lesson is the paint deformation tool. So that is generally right at the bottom, and you have two main buttons that you can work with. One is relax and one is push pull. So the push pull is a really interesting one because it has a paintbrush effect, very much what you see in things like ZBrush or Mudbox and those programs, where you have a push pull value, you have a brush size. So if we increase that, you can see you have a brush to work with, and depending on the push pull value, you can then increase and decrease the intensity of that paintbrush. So let's say you want to push the landscape in, you can basically have a value of, let's say, -0.2, and you can start to manually paint in that landscape as it goes down underwater. So the other thing that I can let you know about this, which is a nice tip to keep in mind, is that if you don't want to affect this edge, it's a good idea to work on a selection of the mesh instead of the whole mesh as a whole. So you can start by selecting the border, and let's just deactivate soft selection so that we don't confuse the two tools. And the next thing is you want to convert the border to the vertices by just holding down Control and clicking on vertex. And then with Alt pressed down, just deselect the other vertices that you don't have on that edge. So what I'm doing is I'm basically now selecting the ones that I don't want to manipulate. And once that is done, then you can press Control I. And now you see that every single vertex is selected besides the ones that are running along this edge. So what that means is that any paint deformation that you now apply to this mesh will not be applied to the ones at the edge, which means that your mesh will not split apart. And this is very, very important to keep in mind so that you don't have to later go and reattach those vertices, since it can become quite messy if you don't get that right from the beginning. So having that mesh selection is probably the biggest tip of the lesson, to always work with the things that you want to and not with the entire object messing up the entire mesh. So the last one just to look at quickly once you've basically moved all the meshes down is you can look at relax, and that basically just equals out the spacing between your vertices, so it would make a rough edge smoother by relaxing the entire mesh. But do notice what it does to the edges. So the edge will become all basically manipulated as well. So what you can do there is you can go back to your edge border and you can convert that to the vertices, Control I. So now you don't have these selected, and if you go back down to relax, you will see that you can now relax your entire mesh and nothing will be deformed along the outer edge. So just another area where I would use this tool is over here. You will see that because we used a relatively low res version of this mesh that we now conformed onto our original mesh that we started with in the beginning of the course, you will see that these edges are a little bit low poly and the edges can be quite sharp. So if you do render this, you will notice these jagged edges. So you have two options here. You can either redo this entire mesh in a much higher resolution, but I really wouldn't worry because it is outside of your area of focus. Remember, the house is going to be here, so the chances of you seeing this are very, very slim. But if you did want to smooth it out, in other words, it would not be a realistic interpretation of the contours anymore, it would be a smoothed version, is we could go and do that relaxing function to that part of the mesh just to ease out that jagged effect. So here you would do the same thing. You would increase your brush size and you could start to smoothen out those edges. You could just also decrease the strength so that you don't overdo it. And by just gently smoothing it over for a couple of seconds, you will see that immediately now you already have a less jagged edge. If you want to continue with that, you can, of course, but just remember that the more you apply the relax tool, the less accurate your mesh is going to actually be. So now you see that you have a much smoother effect. In other words, you don't have those pyramid shaped objects all around, but you do have a incorrect mesh. So that is really up to you as to how far you want to take it. Just remember that your mesh needs to look visually pleasing, and that is at the end of the day the most important thing, that when you do your views you don't have any obvious digital fragments floating around your scene. Great, that is the end of this lesson. We're now going to move on to the house itself. We're going to start building the walls and the slabs in the next lesson, so definitely hang around for that. It's going to be quite an interesting one since we are finally modeling the actual house.